What really happened to Sandi Patty is beyond heartbreaking. 40 Dove Awards, 5 Grammys, 3 presidential inaugurations, a voice critics called nuclear-powered, the highest-paid performer in the history of Christian music. All of it gone. Her music banned from Christian stores. Her name removed from the radio. Not because her voice failed, but because she told the truth, and the community she had given her career to decided that they could not forgive it. Here's the full story.
From the time I was a little girl, I was that kid in the bedroom with the hairbrushes, the microphone, and singing to all these great cast recordings. And I remember seeing The Sound of Music for the very first time.
Sandra Faye Patty was born on July 12, 1956, in Oklahoma City. Her father was a minister of music. Her mother was the church pianist. Music was not something she came to. It was the environment she was born into. She was 2 years old when she sang in public for the first time, Jesus Loves Me, at Phoenix First Church of God. Whatever 2-year-olds are expected to produce, what came out of Sandi Patty stopped people. The family toured churches during summers as the Ron Patty family. She attended Anderson University in Indiana, studied voice under soprano Greta Dominic, recorded commercial jingles, including one for Juicy Fruit Gum, and in 1977, married John Helvering. Now, Helvering wasn't just her husband. He would become her manager. Her personal life and her career were being built by the same person. It was during this period she first encountered Bill Gaither, singing backup for Indiana recording sessions. Gaither recognized what her voice could do and gave her access to an audience most Christian artists spent years trying to reach. She reached it before her first professional album existed. Everything she was building in those years was what she was eventually going to risk. But she did not know that yet. In 1979, a self-produced album made its way to executives at Benson Inspirational Records. They signed her. The record was called Sandi's Song. Her professional career had begun. In 1982, she won her first 2 GMA Dove Awards and began singing backup for Bill Gaither and the Bill Gaither Trio. Her first national tour came in 1984. 2 years later, she sang the national anthem at ABC's broadcast of the Statue of Liberty rededication, watched by tens of millions. Within days, her name was everywhere it had not been before. What followed was extraordinary. The Tonight Show, The Today Show, Good Morning America, Christmas in Washington alongside President Ronald Reagan on NBC, the Grammy Awards television special, the 1988 Republican National Convention, the opening ceremonies of the 1988 presidential inauguration, the Indianapolis 500 national anthem 5 separate years, 3 presidential inaugurations across her career. Her voice has been described in music journalism as nuclear-powered, both in range and in intensity, and that description was not hyperbole. By the late 1980s, she was performing up to 200 concerts a year with a touring staff of over 30 people. She was the highest-paid singer in Christian music, averaging over $100,000 per engagement, which approaches $350,000 in today's terms. 5 Grammys, 4 Billboard Music Awards, 3 platinum records, 11 million records sold, 40 Dove Awards across her career. That's 40, not 2, not 10. 40 separate Dove Awards from the organization that represented the industry she was about to lose. She wasn't just popular, she was the defining voice of an entire genre. 200 concerts a year means 4 performances per week, 50 weeks a year, across the country, with 30 staff, full touring production, and the specific emotional labor of performing songs about hope to audiences who needed exactly that. There was no version of Sandi Patty who showed up and delivered less than what the audience came for. People who worked with her in the late 1980s described a performer who gave everything in the room and then traveled to the next city and gave it again. The consistency between what audiences experienced from the stage and what she was actually living was, for most of that decade, genuine. The fracture, when it came, was not between her faith and her performance. It was between her public wholeness and a private life that was quietly coming apart. and the person watching it come apart from the closest possible distance was the same person running her career. John Helvering was her husband. He was also her manager. That second fact changes the nature of everything that followed. When Sandi Patty's marriage fell apart in 1992, it wasn't a private, personal matter between two people. It was a simultaneous collapse of her marriage and the management structure of her entire career. The person she was leaving was a person who had been running her professional life. The full picture, as she eventually told it, was more textured than the initial headline suggested. The extramarital affair with Dawn Peslis, a backup singer in her touring band, began during a separation from Helvering, not while their marriage was intact. Peslis was married at the time. So was she, legally. What developed between them during that separation became the relationship that broke both marriages and then became the foundation of a new one. The divorce from Helvering was finalized in 1993. Like Amy Grant, who was canceled by the evangelical community the same period for her own divorce and remarriage, Sandi Patty found that the Christian music world did not distinguish between the circumstances of a marriage ending. Divorce was the line. She had crossed it. What nobody publicly discussed at the time was what it meant to divorce your manager. Helvering had not just been her husband. He had been the architect of the career infrastructure that was producing 200 concerts a year and top-tier industry earnings. Walking away from the marriage meant walking away from that structure simultaneously. The business collapse and the personal collapse were the same event. In August 1995, she married Dawn Peslis. 2 weeks later, she was confronted with rumors about the affair. Not 2 years later. Not after an extended period of living quietly with the secret. 2 weeks into her second marriage, the questions arrived. She didn't deny it. Now, this timeline matters. She married Dawn Peslis in August 1995. 2 weeks into that marriage, she was confronted with the rumors. Not 2 years later, after a period of quiet. Not when a journalist obtained a source. 2 weeks after the wedding, while the marriage was new enough that the invitations were still in people's drawers. She could have deflected. She could have said that the rumors were exaggerated or that the details were private. The confession was not forced from her. She chose it at a moment when the alternative was still available. Now, that specific detail changes how the confession reads. She was not confessing something that had already come apart. She was confessing something that was still forming. The choice to tell the truth at that particular moment, when silence was still possible and the new marriage was still new, is the act that defines what kind of person she is. When confronted, Sandi Patty went first to her pastor and then to her congregation. She stood before the people in her church and told them what she had done, in person, without a publicist, without a statement read on her behalf. She then spoke publicly in interviews, answering questions she was not required to answer, and offering details that she could have withheld. She described seeking forgiveness from those she had hurt, including John Helvering and Dawn Peslis's former wife. She described her own choices without constructing alternative interpretations of them. That combination, confession to the congregation first and then to the press, was a specific and deliberate sequence. She didn't go to the press to control the narrative before the church found out. She went to the church first. That order matters in a tradition where pastoral accountability is supposed to precede public reputation management. She later told the Christian Broadcasting Network, "It was the lowest place in my life." She also said that it was the period in which she became most certain the faith she had been singing about her entire career was real, that it held in the places where nothing else did. In her autobiography, Broken on the Back Row, she wrote everything down. Not a rehabilitative narrative, a record. In church culture, the back row is where those who feel unworthy sit. She named her book after the place she had landed and then wrote the story from there. Charles Schulz, the creator of the Peanuts comic strip, was a personal acquaintance who reached out during the hardest period, not to offer public rehabilitation, but to offer private support. He referenced her struggles in his strips. She's quoted in his spiritual biography. That support, from someone outside the Christian music industry's commercial ecosystem, stood in contrast to the response of the industry itself. Together, she and Don Peslis raised 8 children from their respective previous marriages. The book was not commercially rehabilitative. It did not restore the radio rotations or the store placements that had been removed. What it created was a record that belonged to her, a version of her own story that she had written, rather than one that had been written about her. For a woman whose primary instrument had always been her voice, writing the story herself was the closest available equivalent to singing it. She said in multiple interviews that the public exposure and its aftermath were the hardest period of her professional life. She also said they produced something that the easy period never had, a certainty that the faith she had been singing about for 20 years was not a platform or a brand. It was the thing that held when everything else had let go. The 1990s produced 2 major cancellations in Christian music, Amy Grant and Sandi Patty. Different circumstances, same outcome. Grant's divorce from Gary Chapman and remarriage to Vince Gill had generated a wave of boycotts from Christian stores and radio stations. When Patty's divorce and remarriage became public, the same institutions applied the same response. Christian radio stations removed her music from rotation. Christian bookstores pulled her records. Some magazines received complaints from subscribers when they ran advertisements for her albums. Stations that continued playing her music received listener complaints. She had confessed publicly. She had accepted full responsibility. She had sought forgiveness from the people she had wronged. The industry applied a standard that Christian theology itself does not apply. The theological framework she had spent her career communicating, grace and forgiveness and restoration, was not extended to her by the people who sold that framework to its audience. She had built her career on making that faith feel real. The industry that turned on her was powered by the same songs. She said in interviews that there were people who, in their own hurt and brokenness, couldn't come alongside her. She did not frame it as unfair. She described it as people responding from their own pain. Now that specific grace, for the people who rejected her, is something those who have followed her story tend to remember. The Amy Grant comparison is worth sitting with. Both women were canceled in the same decade by the same community for the same category of personal failure. Both had their music removed from the same stores and the same radio stations. Both eventually rebuilt careers that reached audiences their original industry had tried to deny them. But the industry never acknowledged that the standard it had applied to them was not the standard its own theology described. That gap between what Christian doctrine says about forgiveness and what Christian institutions practice when the failure is public enough has never been formally addressed by anyone who organized either boycott. What the career coverage of Sandi Patty's fall almost never addressed was what the years of pressure, the hiding, the exposure, and the rebuilding were doing to her body. She described food as a thing she turned to when the weight of everything else became too much. Not in passing, at length. Her second book, The Edge of the Divine, published in 2010, was entirely about what she called her addiction to food. She named it the same way she had named the affair, without softening the word. She described standing at the edge of decision, the moment when a person must choose whether to keep doing the thing that is destroying them or to step across into something different. She said she had lived on the wrong side of that edge with food for years, through the height of her career, through the scandal, through the rebuilding. 200 concerts a year, the cameras, the arenas, the weight of being the voice. In 2023, she had gastric sleeve surgery in a clinic in Mexico. She lost 90 pounds. She wrote about it publicly, not as a weight loss story, but as a faith story. Another version of the same testimony she had been giving since 1995. Another area of her life where she had chosen to name the thing instead of managing it quietly. The woman who had been the most visible face of contemporary Christian music for a decade had spent large portions of that visibility in a private struggle she did not talk about until she was ready to tell the full truth of it. That pattern, Naming the hard thing, only when she could name all of it, runs through everything she has ever made public about her own life. It also runs against the standard narrative of what a Christian celebrity's testimony is supposed to look like. The expected arc is fall, confession, restoration, and then advocacy from a position of recovered wholeness. Sandi Patty's story keeps finding new floors, new versions of the same question she had been singing about since she was just 2 years old, standing at the front of a church in Phoenix. Whether the faith holds in the place you did not expect to end up. Between 1996 and 2015, Sandi Patty released more than a dozen award-winning albums. She was inducted into the Gospel Music Hall of Fame in 2004. She received the GMA Music in the Rockies Summit Award in 2007 and was named an Indiana Living Legend the same year. She also became a major speaker on the Women of Faith conference circuit, appearing alongside Amy Grant, the other woman the industry had canceled a decade earlier, in arenas across the country. Women of Faith was a platform that allowed her to speak directly to the audience that had once turned its back on her, in her own voice, without the gatekeeping of Christian radio or retail. Some of those stations had still not resumed playing her music. The market that had made her the highest-paid performer in her genre had not fully reopened. She kept recording regardless. In September 2015, she announced her retirement from touring. She said that there comes a time when you should step away. She said music had been her voice when she had not had a voice. In 2016, she released Forever Grateful, an album whose title was both a statement and a summary. She performed first for millions, then thousands, then for whoever wanted to hear her. The voice that music critics had called nuclear-powered did not diminish with the size of the room it was in. In 2017, months after the farewell tour, she returned to perform at a single concert in Chattanooga, backed by an orchestra and over 250 choir voices from local churches. She described it as a special night. The audience that filled the room was not the audience that had boycotted her records in 1992, but some of them probably were. There is no reported moment of formal reconciliation with the Christian music industry. No official apology from the stations or stores that removed her work. No acknowledgement from the organizations that applied the boycott that the standard that they had used was inconsistent with the theology their own events promoted. The record on that side of the story is silence. What Sandi Patty did with that silence was continue to sing. 40 Dove Awards, 5 Grammys, 3 presidential inaugurations, 200 concerts a year, a confession that cost her everything, a food addiction she carried for decades, a surgery in Mexico, and a second book that named all of it. She was 2 years old the first time she sang in a church. She spent the next 60 years returning to that same room, at every level, from the back row to the presidential stage and back. Did the Christian community respond the way it should have? And is there a Sandi Patty song that still stops you when you hear it? Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.